I'm really come here with a good bit of humility, because for an American today to try and instruct Europeans who are leading this movement of resistance is a slightly awkward position. Needless to say, our government has changed in a way that some of us are not that happy about. But I'm going to, first off, this is a critique of the large web platforms. But I have to admit at the outset, I use Google. I have bought books on Amazon. I sell my book on Amazon. I have no choice. As someone says, TINA, there is no alternative. I have used Facebook to promote my book. So I don't mean to say these are useless platforms. I just want to talk to you about what they're doing to our culture. So my life in the early part was deeply involved in a cultural revolution, and I mean that in a real sense. So I was working for Bob Dylan in the 1960s. I was the tour manager for the band. I was the tour manager for Janis Joplin. I made movies with Martin Scorsese, Mean Streets, The Last Waltz. I made movies with Wim Wenders, Until the End of the World. And so I was lucky enough to be at a time where music and then film, where people said the lunatics took over the asylum. The artists got in control of the medium for a short period of time. It didn't last that long, but from, say, 1962 to 1980, it really did. And of course, in the late 70s, a phenomena called the blockbuster entered the common parlance, which meant that if you could make a movie like Star Wars and make $150 million, you would want to make a lot of those. And so if in the late 60s, the best music, I'll cite Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, was also the most popular music, the biggest selling record of the year, or if the best movie in the early 70s, The Godfather, was also the most popular movie, that's something that doesn't happen today. The most popular movie is Transformers or some Marvel comic book, but that's not the kind of movies that are up for the Academy Awards this year. They're usually small movies that a very small number of people see. So somewhere, the culture of popularity and the culture of what's good got separated. And I want to explore with you a little bit of why that happened. So the gentleman drinking the Coca-Cola in the back of the picture with the band is Levon Helm. And those of you with gray hair or no hair, probably who remember the band, know that he sang The Weight, The Night They Rolled Dixie Down up on Cripple Creek. And he was a great singer, an amazing drummer, and he made a good middle-class living. The band were not as big as Cream or the Rolling Stones, but they did okay. They could sell 300,000 or 400,000 records a year, and each of them would make $100,000 a year as a living, and in 1969, that was a good living. And that living continued for many years, because as those you remember, in the 80s, the CD was introduced, and so everybody renewed their record collection. They got rid of all that old vinyl, which now they're trying to get back, or their kids have taken, but they got CDs. And so that money, the royalties for records, continued to flow into Levon's pocket. And in the year 2000, a service called Napster was introduced, and it was the first pirate music service, and essentially every piece of music in the world was now online for free. And for Levon, that meant that the royalties stopped. And he got throat cancer that same year. And so he could no longer go out and perform as a solo musician. And he spent the last 8 years of his life barely in subsistence, barely able to pay for his health care. And yet I could go on YouTube and see streams of the weight with 3 million, 4 million streams on YouTube. And none of that money had flowed to the musicians. So I began to ask myself, how the hell had that happened? So I want to take you back to the beginnings of the internet. It was a countercultural project led by people like Ken Kesey and Stuart Brand of the Whole Earth catalog. They would have acid trips at night and build networks during the day. And the whole idea was to decentralize control and harmonize people. So those of you of my generation remember that in the late 60s, there were very few media sources. In the US, we had 3 television networks and 1 newspaper in any city, and that was the media. So the idea of a decentralized media where a lot of people could talk and get out was a good idea. And of course, the Department of Defense that paid for it through the ARPANET project had their own reason for building a decentralized network. If the Soviets dropped a bomb on Dallas, they wanted the network to route around it and stay up. But it didn't matter that they had their reasons and Ken Kesey and Stuart Brand had their reasons. It all was working out okay. But by the late 80s, a group of people that I call libertarians, and I know that maybe that word doesn't have the same meaning in the Netherlands as it does in the United States, but these were people who believed in the work of Ayn Rand. And this is her book, Atlas Shrugged, and if you've ever had the displeasure of reading Ayn Rand, you know that her books are always featuring these heroic entrepreneurs that are constantly brought down by democracy. Nobody understands them, and they're always getting in the way. And in one of the books, The Fountainhead, the architect blows up his own building in order to keep it from getting screwed up by bureaucracy. So Peter Thiel, who founded PayPal and is kind of the eminence grise philosopher king of this movement, said, "I no longer believe that capitalism and democracy are compatible." He also said that giving women the vote in the United States was the stupidest thing we ever did, but we'll put that aside. So his conception was, could we build a business sphere in which democracy could not impede capitalism? And he started with a company called PayPal, which was an attempt to kind of root around the financial system. And out of PayPal, these gentlemen, and you notice they're all men, who were the leaders of PayPal, all kind of spread out and now are the leaders of most of the important companies in Silicon Valley. He calls them the PayPal Mafia. I don't. So Thiel went so far as to suggest that maybe the way to get away from democracy was to set up your business on what he called a seastead, which is a platform in the middle of the ocean, outside of the range of any government, and that would be the way to be free. Now, of course, he couldn't get anybody to move and live on those platforms, so it didn't really work out so well. But he did continue his thinking, and he had 4 ideas. The web should have no regulations, no government regulation whatsoever. The internet should have no taxes. So Amazon could sell books without any sales taxes, and put 4,000 bookstores in America out of business who had to pay 8 to 10% sales tax. So it could constantly undercut the price that the local bookstore could sell at. There should be no copyright. So what YouTube says to the record business, the music business, is your content is going to be on YouTube whether you want it to or not. All you have to decide is, do you want a little of our advertising money, and I mean it's really little, or not? And if you want a little advertising money, sign this license. It's literally called a license. Now, this is not a license, it's like an extortion scheme, but we'll put that aside and we'll go on to the last idea, which is that the internet could be a winner-takes-all business. Those of you who've studied internet theory, like Sally, know that Metcalfe's law says that the value of a network is equal to the square of the number of users. So it's an exponential equation. So things get big really fast, as Mark Zuckerberg has found. So really, there wouldn't be any need for there to be a second search engine. There wouldn't be any need for there to be another social network if you had one that had 2.4 billion people on it. And there wouldn't ever need to be a second e-commerce player if you had the everything store, which is what Amazon calls itself. Now, Thiel had made the kind of bold statement that in the early 90s, that Silicon Valley would be the center of the world economy. And it turned out he was right. So even as late as 2011, the largest corporations in the world were oil companies. And today, the largest companies in the world are all technology companies. So what happened to the people who made the content which you access through these portals? So this is the music business, fell by 71% since Napster arrived. This is the American newspaper business, even worse, fell by 80% revenues since Google showed up, and Facebook just made things worse. This is the number of stores that have closed in America last year. And this is the fact that probably half of the malls in America, I know you're not plagued with malls, but it's a big deal in America, are going to go out of business. Because Amazon is basically commoditized every retailer. And Amazon's just growing bigger and bigger. Over Christmas, they took 89% of all e-commerce in the United States. They announced last week that they were going to go into the healthcare business, along with Berkshire Hathaway and JP Morgan Chase. So what is Amazon going to do in the healthcare business? They're going to design a platform which will put them between everybody who provides healthcare services in the world. Insurance companies, pharmacies, hospitals, everything. And then they're going to go with their 2 million employees that they have in these three companies, and they're going to go to all these companies to say, you have to integrate with our platform, just like booksellers have to integrate with Amazon's book-selling platform. And then, once they got that working, they'll open it up to every company in America and say, here we have it. And essentially what they will do is what they did to the book business. They will commoditize everybody who is in the healthcare services business because they will have all the power like all aggregators have. Now, it's not that anybody stopped listening to music, reading newspapers, reading books. It's just that the revenue on the order of $50 billion a year got reoriented, reallocated from the people who made content to the people who own the portals through which you access content. So these are the revenue charts of Google, Amazon, and Facebook, which, as you see, go in the exact opposite direction of the revenue charts of all the people who make content. And as Peter Thiel said, competition is for losers. If you want to build a successful business, you have to build a monopoly, which is exactly what they did. So this is Facebook compared to every other social network. And by the way, they own two of the other ones that are really big. This is Amazon's share of the book business. This is Google's 90% share of the search advertising business. Its closest competitor, Bing, has 3%. And last year, companies owned by owned by Google or Facebook, took 88% of all online advertising money. There is no way you can get around it. These are monopolies. And they exercise monopoly power in many different ways. So let me give you an example of if you're a musician. You may think that Spotify is the largest streaming music service in music, but it's not. It's YouTube. Most of your kids listen to most of their music as audio files on YouTube for free. Every single piece of music in the world is available on YouTube for free. So YouTube has almost 60% of the streaming music business, and yet it pays less than 11% of the revenue into the streaming music business. If you had a really popular song and you could get 1 million downloads on iTunes, you would make $900,000. If you had 1 million streams on YouTube, you would make $900. That's a hit song, and it wouldn't pay your rent in Amsterdam. There's another problem with YouTube. It is filled with content that any normal person would think is objectionable. This is a jihadist ISIS video, Daesh as they call themselves, with a Procter & Gamble Bounty paper towel ad on the front of it. Now, needless to say, when Procter & Gamble found they had their ads on the front of ISIS videos, they got a little upset. But as you probably have read, 2 months ago, excuse me, I've been talking for 8 days and I'm losing my voice, but in London, YouTube was filled with pedophile videos, all of which were paying advertising to the people who posted them. And it went so far as the Prime Minister of the UK got upset about this. And YouTube's response was, okay, we'll demonetize them. We'll take the ads off them. When I asked YouTube who got the money for this ad, did ISIS get the money or did you just keep the money? They wouldn't tell me. But this problem is all based on a weird American law called Safe Harbor. It's part of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And essentially it says that you cannot sue YouTube for anything. They are just a passive content provider and they have no control over anything that's on their platform. And so they can't be held liable for anything that's on their platform. Now, this is total nonsense. You probably noticed that there is no pornography on YouTube. They spend millions of dollars a year building artificial intelligence that when someone tries to upload porn, and I promise you they do that about 10,000 times a day, it gets blocked before it ever gets on the platform. So this idea that they've got nothing to do with their content is nonsense. The idea that they're not editors, like regular publishers, is nonsense. You get very different information on Facebook than you get. Just because the editor is an algorithm doesn't make it right. So I want to give you a particular example of how this distorts democracy. So up until May of 2016, and this was in the height of the American election, Facebook had human curators managing the trending topics. And trending topics is what shoots to the top of your newsfeed. And Breitbart and Fox News pounded on them for a month and a half, saying, these humans are prejudiced against conservative news. You have to get them out of the equation. So on May 22, Mark Zuckerberg gave in and took the humans out of the algorithm. That's May 22. So what happened? Okay, once there was no human involved, it's very easy for Cambridge Analytica to post something saying the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. The computer doesn't know that's not true. And if you hit it with 500,000 automated accounts called bots, you shoot it right to the top of the trending topics. You shoot it right to the top of the Google search algorithm. And you can manipulate the news any way you want in that way. And it wasn't just Facebook. It wasn't just the Google search algorithm. It was YouTube. It was all these things. There's a piece in The Guardian today about how YouTube was manipulated. Now, Tim Berners-Lee, who's the man who invented the World Wide Web, said that those kids in Macedonia who were making $5,000 a week manufacturing fake news in their pajamas learned that untruth was more clickable than truth. So these kids had no political agenda whatsoever. In fact, they started out trying to do Bernie Sanders posts, and they didn't get any traffic. So they realized that if they became Trumpistas and would take on Hillary, they could get people going crazy. And so they'd make up a newspaper, the Denver Advocate. They'd put a Google AdSense advertising account, so anytime someone came to the page, they'd make some money. And they'd get a Facebook account, and they'd get a Twitter account, and they'd just ping back and forth between the two. And boy, pretty soon they were learning if the more outrageous stuff they would put up, the more money they could make. And they were making $5,000 a week at the height of the election. Now, these people call themselves libertarians that run these companies. But I have to ask you, is the kid who checks his smartphone 240 times a day free? Does he have liberty? Or is he addicted? And there is growing evidence, including from, some of the people that started Facebook, like Sean Parker, that these companies intentionally built addiction into the system. So this is a book that's very popular in Silicon Valley called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And the schematic in this is you introduce a trigger, some piece of controversial content, that leads to an action. You click on it or post it to your friends. That leads to a reward that's called a like. And then that leads to you reinvesting your time into the platform. So the people who wrote this book referenced B.F. Skinner's work. And I don't know if any of you know the work of the Skinner box, but basically, if you took Psych 101, You saw the little rat in the cage, and there's a little bar that the rat can click. And sometimes the rat gets fed when it clicks the bar, but a lot of times it doesn't get fed. And it has no way of knowing what the randomness of that is. So within a few hours, the rat just is sitting there clicking the bar crazy. That is the kid on Facebook checking to see if they got likes on the posts they made. Having to constantly check back in every 20 minutes, am I getting more likes? Am I getting more likes? This is an addiction protocol that they designed, and my good friend Tristan Harris, who was the design ethicist at Google, eventually had to quit because he realized they had no ethics whatsoever in their design. They only had one plan: maximum amount of minutes on their platform so they can sell you maximum amount of advertising and get maximum amount of data out of you. So I tell young students, you're working for an hour and a half a day for Mark Zuckerberg for free. How does that feel? Karl Marx would be confused. So I want to ask you, what is the business these companies are in? The business is surveillance capitalism. They don't care about content, they don't care about music, they don't care about movies or news or anything. They care about one thing: getting data from you, and if you had any idea how much data they have, you would be shocked. They know where you went, your trail, where you shopped, who you talked to when you're feeling sad, when you're feeling happy. They know who your relations are, what your plans for vacations are. They know everything. And it doesn't escape me to note that, as Edward Snowden told us, when the NSA, the US government, wanted to find out mass surveillance of the American public, they didn't go try and break into everybody's phone or computer. They just went to Google. They got it all. So not content to just have smartphones be the source of their data, now they are planning a wholesale assault on your home. In the US, Amazon noted in their earnings call last night that they sold far more of these little devices than they had ever imagined. That they set a target and they sold like 3x the number of these devices. So this is called a smart speaker. It's not a smart speaker, it's a smart microphone. And it's a microphone that sits in every room in your house if you're a real Amazon fan. And of course, Amazon's thing is, well, you can just ask it what the weather's going to be, or you can ask it to order more potato chips or whatever. But it's listening to everything you have. So I gave a speech at Vanderbilt University 2 weeks ago, and a kid came up to me afterwards. He said, "Oh, now I understand." I said, "My girlfriend came into my kitchen, and I said, 'Oh, I really love your new glasses.' And then within an hour, I was getting advertisements for glasses, and I don't wear glasses, and I don't know how that happened." And she said, "Okay, now I understand." But the question that we have to ask ourselves is all this surveillance really healthy? And it's here in Europe that this is being disputed. And I think it's really healthy. I will tell you that those of us in America who are in the resistance consider Ms. Vestager to be the head of your competition commission, to be a true hero. She is calling these companies to account in a way that no American politician will. And this general data privacy regulation that is going to go into effect in May, while not perfect, is going to change their behavior in a lot of ways in terms of what they can get from you without your permission. And that will be a good step. Now, one of the things I worry about is that these companies have so much power that they can force startups out of business. So this is, Amazon gets into the Whole Foods business, all the food stocks go down. Amazon decides that it's going to get into the home delivery, food business, and Blue Apron, which was the main competitor in the space, the stock tanks. Facebook goes to buy Snapchat. Snapchat refuses. Facebook leaves and says, well, you're going to regret that. And a week before Snapchat goes public, Facebook brings out exactly what Snapchat had designed in a perfect clone. They don't even change the name of it. With Snapchat stories, and then it's Instagram stories, Facebook stories, WhatsApp stories. So these people play hardball. Now, in terms of data, it's sometimes hard for me to convince young Americans that privacy is important. So one of the things I've seized upon is the fact that Consumer Reports has told me that you may think that your insurance rates for your automobile is set by how well you drive. It has nothing to do with it. It's set by where you drive. So I happen to work at USC, which is in the downtown part of LA, which is considered a dicey neighborhood by Allstate Insurance. And so my insurance rates are almost 20% higher than my wife's, who doesn't drive down to USC every day. Where does this dystopian data surveillance world end? So this is an application built by Alibaba in China called Sesame Social Credit. So what Sesame Social Credit does is take your credit score, how well you repay your bank card, and overlay on it a social media score based on everything that you do online and offline in China. So if you played video games for 6 hours last weekend, your social credit score would go down because you're considered a slacker. If you posted something on WeChat that was critical of the Chinese government, your social credit score would go down because you're not patriotic. If you crossed the street in Shanghai in the middle of the block, jaywalking, and were caught on one of the ubiquitous CCTV cameras with facial recognition, your social credit score would go down because you're a lawbreaker. Now you'd say, why would anybody want to be on this? There are 210 million Chinese on Sesame Social Credit, and the President, Xi Jinping, suggested that every Chinese citizen should be on the platform. The thing that scared me the most is the young people, the millennials, post their social credit score on their dating app to prove to potential mates that they're patriotic, conforming citizens who won't get in trouble with the government and thus will be decent marriage material. Now, of course, the ratio of men to women in China in the millennial generation is pretty out of whack, like 3 or 4 to 1. So maybe that's what you have to do. So I'm just going to finish with 2 thoughts. One of the reasons I'm so admiring of Ms. Vestager is that she is not subject to what we call regulatory capture. There's a whole chapter in my book that you will read about how Google captured the Obama administration. When Obama wanted someone to run the patent office, Google said, oh, here, take our patent chief. Of course, everything the patent office did then was pro-Google. When Obama wanted someone to run the antitrust division, oh, here's our lawyer from Silicon Valley. He's really good. Bang. So antitrust, nothing happened. So it's not just Obama, though. So Trump comes in, and the leading candidate to run the Federal Trade Commission was this guy, Sean Reyes, who was the Attorney General of Utah, except he made one comment once that was critical of Google, and Google basically blackballed him, told Trump he's unacceptable to us to be head of the Federal Trade Commission. So Trump got one of Google's ex-lawyers to run the Federal Trade Commission. So I'm just going to end by telling you that a lot of people will say to you that what Vestager is doing and what antitrust is about is outmoded and anti-innovation. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. In 1956, in America, the Bell telephone system, AT&T, was the monopoly phone company in the United States. There was only one. The government sued them, and AT&T signed a consent decree that said that it would license for free any patent it had developed at its labs, Bell Labs, its research and development facility, to any American company or individual. So it just so happened that Bell Labs had invented the transistor, the laser, the semiconductor, the satellite, the cellular system, the solar cell. I mean, essentially all of the underpinnings of the digital economy. And so out of those free patents came Hewlett-Packard, Fairchild Semiconductor, Texas Instruments, Motorola, Intel, ComSat, and a bunch of other companies. That was the beginning of Silicon Valley, and it happened because of antitrust. 20 years later, IBM was the dominant force in mainframe computers. If you wanted to buy an IBM computer, you had to buy IBM software. And IBM refused to unbundle it, and the government sued them in an antitrust court. The suit dragged out for 13 years. And in the end, as IBM was developing the personal computer, it said, screw it. We'll let these two young kids from Seattle, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, make the software. We'll make the hardware because that's where the money is. Now, that was probably IBM's mistake, but still, it led to the rise of Microsoft. So cut to 20 years later, Microsoft is so powerful, and a lot of you probably remember this. When you bought a PC, you had to use their browser and search capability, Internet Explorer. And you couldn't use any other. So the government sued them and said, no, you can't do that. And so finally they gave up on that, and that allowed Google to enter the system. I would argue now we're 20 years later, and we may have to think about, again, the application of antitrust to create more competition. One of the ways that might be done would be the remedies we applied to AT&T. Google has 25,000 patents. Instead of letting them fight everybody who's trying to make autonomous cars, make them license them for free. Make them give away their search algorithms for free. Make them give away their advertising patents for free. Make them give away their home thermostat patents, all these patents. Maybe that's a solution. So I just want to finish by one thought. I think that what encourages me so much about, and I was just in Denmark, and you know, that's where Ms. Vestager is from, in Copenhagen. I'm so encouraged by what's happening here in Europe. And quite frankly, we are surfing on the back of your resistance. And you are leading the charge, and the very fact that you do things like GDPR is forcing these companies to change for the whole world. So I'm very encouraged, and I'm optimistic that changes will come. And so let's take it from there. Thank you very much.
We were full of optimism in those early days of the internet, that this was going to be the great democratizing technology that would give people access to information, easy communication, world peace, I mean, all sorts of wonderful things. And I think there are 3 points I want to kind of make about that. And I'm not quite, I'm curious to what you think about this, what other people think about this. One is, we had heard this before. We heard exactly the same things with the printing press, with radio, with television even. I mean, it's probably hard to imagine now that anyone ever thought television was going to be a medium for liberation and world peace. But when television came out, people did. They thought it was very empowering, liberating. People would have a voice. Every single medium of communication and information has had that kind of promise. Most of them end in tears.
So I think what's different about the internet is scale. So if you imagine Rupert Murdoch spent his whole career, 60 years, saying, if I really buy all these companies, all these TV companies, all these satellite companies, I could get to a reach of 80 million people. So Mark Zuckerberg wakes up every morning and has access to 2.4 billion people. Nobody in the history of media has ever been as powerful as that. And so it's scale, and it's this network effect. This is a fact that it moves so fast, and I don't think, in terms of where we went wrong, I don't think the politicians had a clue what was going on. I think, I quote in my book early a famous quote from Martin Luther King, said, "We have been sleeping through a revolution." And I think that's really the fact. So
no, I think
that's first. Okay.
Okay. We might come back to that.
Okay.
My other two are kind of shorter, so maybe you can hang on to them. One is, there's a kind of famous kind of urban myth, probably, when Mao Zedong was interviewed by a kind of French journalist and asked, this was probably sometime in the kind of 60s or something, what was the kind of effect of the French Revolution? And Mao kind of thought for a moment, said, too early to tell. So you got to kind of take a long view on things. So, things that now look kind of desperate, think, oh my God, is this ever going to change? Maybe if we kind of wait and have a bit, it might change. So that's one thing. How are things actually really going to play out in the long term? And then another thing that really kind of struck me when I was reading the book was, there are other technologies that have gone wrong, like nuclear power. So, another bit of disclosure to this fine-looking audience. My father was a nuclear engineer. When he was young, he thought he was saving the world, that it was going to be atoms for peace, cheap energy, none of this mess that you get with oil and all of this kind of other stuff. In the course of his lifetime, feelings about nuclear power changed. Of course, it's coming back again, which is interesting, even by environmentalists. And of course, one of the things that changed, and this is what gives you a bit of hope, and sometimes family relations were a bit strained, but that's a different kind of story, there was resistance. People fought nuclear power. They said there are alternatives, so there should be alternatives. We should invest in other forms of energy production. So that gives me some hope for a longer term future.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is a long battle. I agree with you. And I think the sense of we don't know how this is going to work out. But what worries me right now is The Economist had a cover story on this very subject a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. And essentially they said in the article, look, if investors are correct and the PE multiples of these stocks are not just wacko, then investors expect these companies to get 3 times bigger than they are. So that means that Google would have a value of $2 trillion, say. So by that point, it would be bigger than almost every country. And then you have to worry, okay, do we get into we were talking about William Gibson, do we get into some kind of corporate state situation where these companies have so much power that really governments are kind of helpless to deal with their power? And what really worries me is that the artificial intelligence business, which I truly do believe will be the next big development in technology, is a virtuous circle business. In other words, the people with the most data get the better results. Tracy and I were at Wolters Kluwer yesterday, and a very eminent linguist, got up and said, a year ago, Google Translate for Dutch was terrible. Today, it's great. So in 1 year, the artificial intelligence engines, with all that input, were able to refine it to the place that was useful. Now, that, on one sense, that's a fabulous thing. But the point that I'm trying to make is that artificial intelligence builds on itself, and I know from talking to the young kids in the engineering school at University of Southern California, they all want to go to work for one of these three companies because that's where the big data is. And so they can hire the best scientists, and they will get better. And as I tried to explain about Amazon in the health business, or Google in the transportation business, or Amazon in the food business, they will only expand out their reach into every possible area of commerce where they think there's a lot of money. Obviously, food, medicine, and transportation are the first three targets. If we don't have some control, then it will be too late. I mean, I really do believe it will be too late. And the sense that I have is that these companies already are kind of super states. And it's just a matter of what, you know, if I thought there was a market solution, like if I said to this audience, okay, I'm going to start a startup to take on Google in the search advertising business. I want everyone who will invest with me to raise their hand. Right? Nobody raised their hand. You would run for the exit if I were trying to get your money for such a foolish enterprise. So there's not going to be a challenger to Google in search advertising. I'm sorry to, you know, Google says, oh, competition is just a click away. It's total nonsense. Facebook has 75% of the social mobile business. So
why are you optimistic after all?
Yeah.
Because I believe that people like Vestager, and if we get a regime change in America, you know, certainly Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, everybody who's running for president in the Democratic side is talking about antitrust as the top topic that they talk about. So I'm saying, and it's not just me, because this book has gotten kind of popular in the United States, I get asked to come in to speak to very large investment groups because they all have huge investments in these companies, like billions. And their biggest worry is, will regulation impede these companies? Because we're planning that they're going to get 100 times bigger, right? And, you know, one of the biggest managers of all funds in America said to me, if Elizabeth Warren was president, I'd sell. But until then, I think they've got a 20-year run to dominate the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up the kind of comparison with, you know, these are bigger than states. They don't have armies yet, okay, I mean, that might happen. And I also, you know, it reminded me when you were saying, okay, you were talking to linguists yesterday, and I think linguists are really important in this, particularly with AI and machine learning, as you were saying. But linguists are also important because they remind us of the importance of language. And I think one of the other things I'd like to hear you say more about is, as part of the kind of resistance, how should we be talking about this? Because I mean, in the book, you pretty consistently kind of talk about the internet in the singular, and I would always kind of wrap my students around the head if they did that, but you're not allowed to do that, but I would think about it. But one of the things that, you know, in our lifetime, the metaphors that we've used to describe this stuff have changed a lot. So, you know, we used to talk about, you know, Gore back in the day would talk about the superhighway, which is a very much, and, you know, we know why he did that, as father built roads. He thought about it as a utility, which has certain kind of expectations. How do you regulate it? How do you see it? But there are other kinds of things. So we've had, this is a Dutch audience. How many of you people still have a DDS email account? How many of you know what the DDS is? Yeah, okay. That was the digital city. It was one of these kind of early kind of experiments online. We're connecting people in Amsterdam. It was all very nice. And we had lots of, village squares, agoras. That was a whole different way of talking about the internet in terms of connection and sociality and whatever. And then you've got the people who talk about it as a library and the world brain, and the others who talk about it as a shopping mall. These are all very different ways of thinking about the internet. What should we be calling it now to try and break the power of these big platforms?
Well, I mean, I referenced Tim Berners-Lee, who built the World Wide Web, and he said the task we have before us is two things. One, we need to re-decentralize the web. We have to introduce that decentralization. And we have to figure out a way that your data can sit in a little black box that you only give it out if you're going to get some commercial advantage for yourself in letting people have it. So an airline wants to know your travel history so that it can make offers to you. They've got to give you a discount, a deep discount, in order to get access to that. And that's what he's trying to build now. So, I mean, some people in the States are suggesting that blockchain, and not to be confused with Bitcoin, which is a Ponzi scheme, but blockchain is a way to make this decentralized internet happen. And so, again, I don't think that we shouldn't worry about how we do it. We just have to say, here's a few principles that we need to kind of all agree on. And one of those is that the notion of decentralization is healthy. And it sounds to me like even these early ideas were all about localism. How do we make it work for people locally?
But John, I'm intrigued nevertheless by how we would achieve this decentralization, because one thing I know for sure, the companies in the subtitle of your book are not going to be happy about this, and they're very powerful. So how?
Well, John D. Rockefeller was very powerful when he owned the Standard Oil Company, and he had 84% of the oil business in the United States in 1906. And President Roosevelt said, no, break it up. And he broke it up into 7 companies. So, I mean, there's 2 big theories about antitrust, one of which is what Ms. Vestager holds, which is that competition is the critical thing. So in that theory, maybe we do have to make Facebook sell Instagram, sell WhatsApp, and have these 3 companies competing against each other, and maybe one of them will offer you a really good social network that isn't so invasive and isn't stealing all your data. Maybe Google does have to sell YouTube and sell DoubleClick, and those 3 companies all have to compete. I mean, that's one theory. The Americans, unfortunately, fell into a thesis of what is known as consumer welfare theory, which is the only thing that matters when 2 companies merge is if prices go up. And so under the American theory, Amazon could buy every company in the world, and because they have so much pricing power to push prices lower, nothing would happen. But, that's a big, kind of existential question.
I find it also very interesting that, of course, so much of innovation and technology has come from the US, and now you're looking to Europe to lead the vanguard in the resistance.
Well, because
how much of what
you're
Europe
not
decides
politically captive. You don't have a political system that totally relies on hundreds of millions of dollars to get people elected. Look, I mean, there's a reason this happened. For a century, the Democratic Party was kind of our version of the Labor Party, and it relied on labor funding for its election because the Republican Party relied on the plutocrats. And then Reagan set out to just destroy the labor unions, and he was very successful, and that's continued. And so labor doesn't have any money anymore. And so Bill Clinton woke up one day and said, hey, Silicon Valley, they're kind of culturally like me. They're kind of culturally liberal. They believe in gay rights and these things, so I'll get money from them. And they did. They gave millions, and same with Obama. But they became so dependent on that money that when they got in office, the last thing they were going to do is go hit them with an antitrust suit.
But as you mentioned in your talk, we do have a strong tradition of antitrust. Bell Telephone, IBM, even Microsoft. Can it be done again, or is that moment past, given the American dependence on financiers?
Well, that's the argument that's going on very radically. So I don't know if it came over here, you saw this, but there was a very important think tank called New America Foundation that was supporting a group of antitrust scholars called the Open Markets Group. And they were very much of the Brandeis School, the competition, the Vestager thing. And when Vestager fined Google $2.7 billion, they wrote a blog post on New America Foundation site saying, this is really important, this is great. And Eric Schmidt, who had financed the New America Foundation, called the president and said, get rid of those guys. And she did the next day. So this is a battle. Now they're now off on their own, and they've got new financing, and they're going to continue the fight. But, you know, this is a battle, and it's being waged. I mean, we haven't really talked about the election, but that also has put these companies in the bullseye of politicians in terms of calling them to account. And they're trying to avoid the responsibility, but they're going to have to deal with it eventually.
It's the new Me Too.
Yeah.
Me Too money.
Yeah.
You said that you'd given a lot of talks in various corporate offices because of the book. Have you spoken with Facebook, Google, and Amazon? How have they reacted? Have they invited you in with open arms to come lay the whip across their backs?
Well, I mean, their basic stance was the same as was in Denmark, in Copenhagen this week, where the head of Google was invited to be a co-respondent in my talk, and they declined. I've been on Fox News, I've been on NBC, I've been on CBS, and every time they've invited someone from Facebook or Google to be on, and they refuse. When Congress asked Google, Facebook, and Amazon and Twitter to come up to talk about the election, normally when that happens, the CEOs have to show up. We all know the famous thing of the tobacco, heads of all the tobacco companies with their hand up, swearing that tobacco was not addictive, right? So, and the CEOs of these companies refused to show up. They just sent a low-level lawyer, which shows you how much their theory is, in a year this will blow over and we won't have to worry about it. I think someone at the dinner table even suggested that, you know, that maybe we'll be on to the next outrage and we'll forget about it.